3 years ago, The Guardian published an article as a follow-up to a report on the experiences of Black female professors working at universities. One of the report's main findings was that these individuals had to overcome bullying, stereotyping, and institutional neglect in order to win promotion. The report, published by University and College Union, recommended that universities be more transparent about the promotion process to professorial positions and that they have dedicated initiatives for Black female academics. The main goal of the report is visible in the words of Matt Wedup, the union's head of policy, who said, "We need to look at how to transform a system that Black female professors say is riddled with unfairness and bias."
Hi everyone. So that is one thing that will lead us into the topic of today, women of color in academia. Well, we hope you stay with us today here and that you enjoy the podcast. As you know, we really appreciate our listeners, and if you can, leave us a review so that we can continue making these. That's it for today. Enjoy and welcome to Beating Bias.
Beating bias. Beating bias. Beating bias. We are trying to uncover the biases. Gender bias, race bias. There's a bias for everything. I'm hoping we can do something about this bias.
Beating bias.
Beating bias.
Beating bias. Beating bias.
On Beating Bias, we aim to dissect the preconceived opinions, feelings, and tendencies in everyday life that have led us to the often unacknowledged discriminatory practices that have reigned in our society for centuries. Welcome to Beating Bias. In October 2016, the Diversity Commission of the University of Amsterdam presented their report on how to improve diversity at the university. The report diagnoses the institution as, quote, "a case of strong egalitarianism coupled with a lack of diversity literacy." And after the report and its findings were presented, the commission was dismantled by the university. RED, or RED, is a Dutch website that presents itself as a podium for journalistic development, and on the website, there's an interview with Alfie Martis that was published. At the time of the interview, she was a student at the University of Amsterdam and a contact member of the Diversity Forum that oversaw the work of the dismantled Diversity Committee. In the article, she argued that the university lacked social justice and awareness of its colonial past. She mentioned that the UvA should at least consider to make their campuses and buildings more comfortable for internationals and students with a different identity. She also said that the same goes for the curriculum and the staff. It all needs an evaluation when it comes to the issue of diversity, is what she said. In relation to the dismantlement of the Diversity Committee, Marta stated that, instead of trying to change, the university blindly looked away from the report and saw it as allegations and not as facts. So, how can the academic environment of the university improve if there is a failure to see where there is wrongdoing?
What is happening in Dutch academic institutions? Why is there such a pushback for change? And where do these gender and race biases come from? Today's topic is the intersectional experience of women of color in academia. What are their experiences? How does their identity play a role? What are the psychological theories that can help us explain these biases in universities? And is there something we can do about it?
Y'all know where the term women of color came from?
Before we start, I want to zoom into the concept of woman of color. I hereby want to disclaim that it is a broad and culturally charged term that refers to a very heterogeneous group of people. People whose experiences cannot be overgeneralized. Throughout this episode, we have to be mindful of where its boundaries lie. In fact, who counts as a person of color? A Alongside the information gathered for this episode, we attempted to form a more structured conception of the term that should allow us to better understand and contextualize the nuances within these findings. So, who counts as a woman of color? Initially, the term could potentially be understood as simply non-white woman. However, who is to say what that means? The term goes beyond skin color, has an intergenerational nature, and is culture and is also context dependent. We are what we are in relation to others. A major pitfall within the words of color is that we can unintentionally obscure various distinct experiences of the individuals it encompasses. Nevertheless, within these experiences that we present in this episode, we aim to uncover the thread that connects them all. Firstly, let's understand that women of color face various layers of discrimination due to their overlapping identities, and that this discrimination has also developed its own nature within the academic environment. In order to dive deeper into this, we also need to comprehend that universities have a history of elitism and exclusion. For instance, it wasn't until 1876 that universities were open to women in the Netherlands.
There was nowhere in the country that women could study to receive the same university education as was available to men.
They are predominantly white, male-dominated, hierarchy-based spaces. Within these spaces, we could argue that white skin is certainly perceived as a passport and associated with unearned advantage, which has a tendency of being invisible to those who do not inhabit it. The same goes for male privilege. Finally, when it comes to universities in the West, there potentially is a third level of complexity with regard to what these women often experience, which could potentially be their international background and all that comes with migrating to a different country to work in the academic field. Hence, why we are using intersectionality as the analytical framework to analyze these experiences. So, let us take some steps back. What is intersectionality?
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have.
You just heard Kimberly Crenshaw there. She coined the term intersectionality in 1989 to better understand how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege, since it identifies multiple factors of advantage and disadvantage.
Let's dive deeper into what these experiences actually are. To begin, we can discuss the importance and implications of representation or lack of representation within organizations. Cantor's theory of proportions of 1977 suggests that those who differ from the norm within the corporate hierarchy, which in this case is academia, encounter a cycle of cumulative disadvantage, whereas those who fit the norm experience a cycle of cumulative advantage. Her theories imply that the more ways in which one differs from the, between quotation marks, norm, the more social interactions will be affected within multiple contexts. The norm then often meaning cis white hetero men. So a woman of color diverges from it in at least two ways, because of her gender and because of her race. So situations in which a woman of color might experience marginality are multiplied depending on her marginal status within various contexts. Let's say that this woman of color is trans or queer. In that case, her marginality would then again grow. Because of this, one could argue that it is sometimes difficult to tell whether race or gender stereotyping, or transphobia in this case, is the one thing that is operating in a specific situation. According to Cantor's findings, women in the minority inhabit a context characterized by some of the following: being more visible and on display, feeling more pressure to conform, to make fewer mistakes, becoming socially invisible, finding it hard to gain credibility, being more isolated, being more likely to be excluded, having fewer opportunities to be sponsored or promoted, facing misperceptions of their role in their organization, being stereotyped, facing more personal stress. That's only a part of what it actually means. But those in the majority face the opposite social context. They are seen as one of the group, preferred for promotion by others that are in fact inhabiting higher level positions. Women of color clearly make up the minority within Dutch universities, meaning that this lack of diversity and representation within these spaces greatly contributes to their negative experiences. Caroline Sotelo wrote a paper titled Woman in Academe, Living with Multiple Marginality. In the paper, she researches the experiences of the faculty women of color. Out of the interviews, it was found that they perceive that being both minority and female hampers their success as faculty members. Themes that emerge from the study interviews include 1. Feeling isolated and under-respected, 2. Salience of race over gender, 3. Being underemployed and overused by departments and/or institutions, 4. Being torn between family, community, and career, and 5. Being challenged by students. All of this is only the tip of the iceberg. But here we do not only bring up heaps of information on bias, but we actually attempt to beat the bias, and in order to do so, we need to understand the whys. So let's finally dive into the psychological theories that will help us understand what is behind these behaviors towards women of color within these spaces.
In-groups versus out-groups, tribalism, or an us versus them mentality.
Let me start by introducing intergroup bias. What is this? So let's say I ask you for a big favor, but in this case you don't know me. Your answer then would be quite different than if your brother asks you for that same favor. But also imagine a friend asks you that favor, or someone that was in the same football team as yours. Those are all things that you would take into account in your decision making, knowingly or unknowingly, also depending on what the favor is, of course. But in reality, you will take those things into account. This in-group, out-group categorization, this tendency we have to talk about us and others, this is what leads to this bias. Intergroup bias thus refers to the tendency that people have to favor the individuals that belong to their in-group, to those that are from the out-group. So, why do we have that bias? Okay, where to start? I will commence by explaining some basic theories to understand this. So, people tend to categorize each other. That's a fact. According to the realistic conflict theory, even for individuals who do not have prejudiced or authoritarian personalities, intergroup bias should emerge when there is group competition for valued resources. We could potentially argue that promotions and recognition within the academic context are the resources people are competing for. Nonetheless, I would argue that the experiences of women of color in Dutch academia are not necessarily related to valued resources only. The social categorization theory is a different theory. This one states that intergroup bias does not have to rely on group competition over valued resources. It rather relies on people's propensity to categorize individuals into groups. People thus categorize women of color as that, and since Dutch universities are white male-dominated spaces, they will be in the minority, and hence othered by the majority due to their categorization. what we could see as an extension of that theory is the social role theory. So, where do gender role beliefs come from? According to this theory, they arise because people observe female and male behavior and assume that the sexes possess corresponding dispositions. Thus, men and women are thought to possess attributes that equip them for sex-typical roles. These attributes are evident in gender stereotypes. Because of these 2-3 theories, women of color are distinctly categorized as a specific group, as well as the fact that they are expected to follow a specific role. Both of these theories then contribute to a bias between groups. The intergroup bias, which, as I already stated, it explains that some individuals favor the individuals within their own group to those that are outside of it. To that, I'd like to add that individuals choose certain groups to advance themselves in society. It is a fact that some groups are perceived to have greater social status and power than other groups. So we could potentially state that able-bodied, cis-white, hetero men of high socioeconomical backgrounds, by the way, have most power over those that diverge from this framework of what we often unknowingly see as the norm. Norm between quotation marks, by the way. If we want to specifically address the negative behavior towards other ethnicities, we can then refer to the behavioral immune system theory. So Murray and Schaller, okay, they argue that humans possess a collection of psychological mechanisms that enables individuals to detect pathogens in their environment and motivate behaviors that prevent these pathogens from then entering the body. This means that through this theory, they argue that stigmatization and aggression towards ethnic minorities are sometimes accompanied by claims that such groups carry contagious diseases, for example. They would call the stigmatization and disgust behavior an old survival mechanism. Nevertheless, I would like to argue that such statements can be quite problematic, since they sometimes justify discrimination and consequentially, people cease to be encouraged to change their behavior, since it has now a scientific explanation. Therefore, I clarified looking into what has brought us to have certain biases does not mean that we will justify them. So let me be clear about that. That is definitely something that I want to disclaim because it's important to acknowledge it. Okay, so how to conclude all of this? We have now looked into why we have certain biases in certain situations. We can then maybe this way try to explain why initially we have those biases in these, predominantly male white institutions. So what to do about it? There are things that universities have been doing for a while, like, I don't know, diversity training, for example, but there is countless of evidence that mandatory diversity training does not do anything. Diversity training is one of those things that have been used since the 60s, I believe, and since then it has not shown any type of improvement. Even worse, it actually backfires in some cases because people are reluctant to be forced into acting or doing a certain way. So it is actually a structural problem that we should try to tackle in several ways. Firstly, by having, if we want to have diversity trainings, then let them be real and good and informed and non-mandatory. But also, why are minorities the ones that have to adapt to a certain space? Why do we invite women of color into a white space and expect them to then be white, to act white, to not be different? So it's not about let me invite you into this whiteness, but it's like, come and make this space yours as well. I don't know if that is clear for some of you, but this is how I think we should approach it. And to finish it up, something that I love that Professor Bell Hooks once said and really deeply connects to what I just mentioned is that, in a 1995 interview for the Times Higher Education Supplement, she stated that, and I quote, "Assimilation, touted as an answer to racial divisions, is dehumanizing. It requires eradications of one's blackness so that a white self can come into being." And this is precisely what we don't want. So, yeah, it's about really eradicating the roots of the problem. And I think we cannot expect it to happen from the minorities, but we really have to deconstruct what we have now to really get there. We have to beat the bias. So, I hope you enjoyed. I thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you next time. Beating bias. We are trying to uncover the biases. Gender bias, race bias, there's a bias for everything. I'm hoping we can do something about this bias.
Beating bias.
Beating bias.